We thought there was something wrong with the criminal. But what if the real story was that the nation helped create the crime? ZeitCrimes explores the crimes that didn't just shock us. They reshaped society, power, and history itself. ZeitCrimes, crimes that changed the nation.
Helter Skelter, the Manson Murders, Ideology, Manipulation, and the End of the 60s. Charles Manson did not kill anyone. That is a fact that is easy to forget in 50 years of mythology. And it matters enormously for understanding what the Manson case actually was. He directed, inspired, and psychologically engineered the deaths of 9 people across 2 nights in August 1969. But the hands that held the knives and the guns belonged to other people, young men and women, most of them from ordinary American families, who had been transformed through a sustained process of psychological manipulation into people capable of murder. This episode is about that transformation. It is about what Charles Manson was and how he built a family. It is about the specific people who were murdered and the specific people who murdered them. It is about the investigation, the trial that produced one of the longest and most extraordinary legal proceedings in California history, and the political and sociological ramifications of an event that did not merely shock America, but fundamentally altered how the country understood the 1960s, the counterculture, and the relationship between idealism and violence. I want to be explicit about 2 editorial commitments that guide this particular episode. First, the victims are at the center of the story. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno LaBianca, and Rosemary LaBianca. They were all human beings. They were not symbolic endpoints of a cultural narrative. Each of them will be named and given their full biographical due. Second, Charles Manson was not a genius. The mythology of Manson as a mesmeric mastermind of extraordinary intelligence is itself a product of the mythology he cultivated and that the media amplified. He was a skilled manipulator operating on specific psychological vulnerabilities in a specific historical moment. Understanding how he did what he did requires demystifying him, not adding to the mystique. So with that in mind, I'd like to make a content note. This episode contains detailed description of multiple homicides, extensive discussion of psychological manipulation and cult dynamics, and engagement with racist ideology that Manson used as both motivation and cover. On August 9, 1969, Cielo Drive, Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, California. It is just before sunrise, and a housekeeper named Winifred Chapman is walking up the long driveway towards the rented house at the top of the hill, arriving for work. She notices something wrong before she reaches the house. There is a wire line across the gate. There is a car in the driveway she does not recognize. And then, as she gets closer, she sees things she cannot process. She runs back down the driveway. She runs to a neighbor's house. She says, "There are bodies up there. There are bodies." The Los Angeles Police Department will arrive within the hour. What they find will not be made sense of immediately, or for months, or, in some of its deeper dimensions, ever. 4 people are dead inside and outside the house at 10050 Cielo Drive. A fifth person is dead in a car at the foot of the driveway. The word pig has been written on the front door in one of the victims' blood. There is no apparent motive. There is no apparent connection between victims and the killer. There are also no witnesses. The following night, in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, 10 miles away, 2 more people will be killed in their home. The word "death to pigs" will be written on the wall. "Rise" and "helter skelter" will be written in blood on the refrigerator door. 9 people dead in 2 nights, and a city that was already on edge, already 3 months past the assassination of Robert Kennedy in the same city, already 2 years past the Watts uprising, already feeling the fractures that the 1960s had opened, begins to understand that something has happened that it does not have a category for. Not to mention the reinstatement of the military draft, the Nixon presidency promised to lead a conservative push against the hippie movement, and the Santa Barbara oil spill, which causes an environmental crisis and fueling massive anti-corporate sentiment in California. I'm your host, and this is ZeitCrimes. We are going to talk about the Manson murders, what they were, who committed them, who ordered them, why, and what they meant for the counterculture, for Los Angeles, for America, and for our continuing struggle to understand the relationship between charisma, ideology, and the willingness to commit violence in the name of a cause. And for us to process this, we're going to start in California around 1969, at the end of the decade, the very world Manson inhabited. So Los Angeles in 1969 was a city simultaneously at the height of its cultural influence and in the early stages of a deep and protracted crisis. The film industry was undergoing its most radical transformation since the coming of sound. The old studio system had collapsed, and what would become the new Hollywood was being assembled from its ruins by directors such as Francis Ford Coppola, Roman Polanski, and Dennis Hopper, who were making films that reflected the upheavals of the decade rather than suppressing them. The Sunset Strip was a national center of rock musical culture. Laurel Canyon, Topanga Canyon, and the Santa Monica Mountains hosted an elaborate ecosystem of musicians, artists, writers, and the various categories of people who orbit such ecosystems. This was also a Los Angeles that had experienced a 1965 Watts uprising, 6 days of rebellion in which 34 people died and over 1,000 were injured, sparked by a traffic stop and fueled by decades of segregation, poverty, and police brutality in Black Los Angeles. The uprising had not resolved the conditions that produced it. It had simply made those conditions visible, briefly, to a white Los Angeles that had been largely unaware of them. And it was also a city 3 months past June 5th, 1968, when Senator Robert Kennedy had been shot at the Ambassador Hotel, moments after claiming victory in the California Democratic primary. The assassination of Kennedy following 14 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., following 4.5 years after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, had produced a specific kind of collective psychic wound that was present throughout American life in 1969, and that was particularly acute in Los Angeles where it happened. The counterculture that had flourished in Haight-Ashbury in 1967, the Summer of Love, the idealism of flower power and peace and communal living, had by 1969 undergone a decisive transition. The naive utopianism of the early hippie movement had been tested by reality and found insufficient. What remained was more complex, more fragmented, and in some quarters more dangerous. The drugs were harder, The ideology was more extreme, and the social structures that may have provided stability had been deliberately dismantled in the name of a freedom that for some participants had become indistinguishable from chaos. This is the world that Charles Manson moved through, and that he understood with the specific intelligence of someone who had spent most of his life studying how to exploit people. He did not create the counterculture. He was a parasite on it. He found his vulnerabilities and he used them. And so we're going to examine the counterculture and its contradictions at this point. The counterculture of the 1960s was, at its best, a genuine movement of social transformation, an insistence that the values of the post-war American consensus, that is, conformity, consumption, the suppression of the individual in the service of institutional order, were insufficient and harmful. The opposition to the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement's challenge to racial hierarchy, the feminist movement's challenge to gender hierarchy, the gay rights movement beginning to assert itself, all of these were serious political projects with serious moral foundations. But the counterculture also had a specific set of vulnerabilities that were built into its ideological structure. Its rejection of authority was so thoroughgoing that it had difficulty distinguishing between the authority that deserved rejection, racist institutions, unjust laws, corporate manipulation, and the authority that served genuine human needs, which is the protection of children, the maintenance of basic social trust, the structures that prevent strong people from exploiting weak ones. And there was the emphasis on consciousness expansion through psychedelic drugs produce a population of young people who were, in specific and documentable ways, more susceptible to manipulation. LSD and other hallucinogens, taken frequently and in uncontrolled settings, altered the brain's capacity to maintain the kind of critical distance from experience that makes resistance to manipulation possible. This is not a moral judgment about drug use. It is a clinical observation about the effects of specific substances on specific cognitive processes. And it is essential to understanding how Charles Manson was able to do what he did. The communal living movement, which produced dozens of intentional communities across California and the Southwest in the late 1960s, created social environments where the ordinary checks on individual power, diverse social networks, independent economic resources, outside perspectives, they were all systematically removed. So a person who lived in the Spahn Ranch with the Manson family had typically severed connections with their family of origin. They have given up their independent income, and instead they surrounded themselves with people whose reality was defined by Charles Manson himself. This is, by the definition used in contemporary cult research, a totalizing social environment. This is, by the definition used in contemporary cult research, a totalizing social movement. It is the environment in which manipulation becomes most effective and resistance becomes least possible. In this segment, we're going to discuss Charles Manson himself, who he actually was. And we have to go back to his origins of 1934 to 1967. Charles Miles Manson was born on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was 16 years old at the time of his birth. She was unmarried. She was, by the accounts available, a deeply unstable person who spent much of Manson's early childhood in and out of jail, and in and out of his life. His biological father is listed on some records as one Colonel Scott, a man who had a brief relationship with Kathleen and who played no subsequent role in Manson's life. His mother later married a man named William Manson, whose surname Charles took. Manson's childhood was one of sustained instability. There were periods of abandonment, periods with relatives, a stint in a reform school in Terre Haute, Indiana, after his mother was imprisoned for robbery. He escaped from reform schools multiple times. He committed a series of car thefts, robberies, and eventually a federal offense, driving a stolen vehicle across state lines that eventually brought him into federal prison at the age of 16. His criminal record from age 16 through his release from Terminal Island in Los Angeles in 1967, at the age of 32, is essentially unbroken. He served time in a series of federal institutions: the National Training School for Boys in Washington, the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, the United States Penitentiary at Terminal Island. He also served time in the District of Columbia Jail, the Federal Penitentiary at McNeil Island, and the Los Angeles County Jail as well. He spent 17 of his first 32 years apparently incarcerated. What he learned during those years is very important. He learned to read people. He developed an understanding of what makes people susceptible to influence, to authority, to the promises of someone who presents themselves as knowing what others do not. He studied Scientology while in prison and applied its techniques, stripped of their original context, to his own purposes. He studied the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which was an occult organization that combined Christianity with satanic iconography, and that would later be seen by some researchers as a significant influence on his thought. He became a capable guitar player and convinced himself and others that a music career was his legitimate destiny. When he was released from Terminal Island in March 1967, Manson asked to stay. The prison was the only stable environment he had known. His request, of course, was denied. He was 32 years old. He was being released into San Francisco at the precise moment when the summer of love was beginning, and he was, by his own later account, astonished at what he found. Thousands of young people who had abandoned the structures of mainstream society and were actively looking for someone to tell them what to do next. And so what happens next is Manson starts to build a family. These are the years of 1967 through 1969. Manson's initial base of operations after release was the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, and then the broader Bay Area. He was, from the beginning, performing the role of a guru, which was the wise, experienced, spiritually advanced teacher who offers to guide the lost and the searching. He was extremely good at this performance for reasons that are comprehensible if not admirable. He spent 17 years in institutions where the ability to read power dynamics and adapt to them was essential to survival. He understood at an instinctive level what people needed to hear in order to attach themselves to someone. So he targeted, with consistent specificity, young women with troubled family backgrounds, poor self-image, and a need for approval that conventional society had not met. He told them they were special. He told them they had been misunderstood by the straight world. He told them that with him, they were finally seen and finally free. The mechanism by which this worked is described in clinical literature on cult dynamics and coercive control. It begins with live bombing, overwhelming a person with positive attention, making them feel uniquely understood and valued. It continues with isolation, gradually separating the person from the family and friends and other sources of perspective and support. It advances through the introduction of a belief system that explains the world in ways that makes the leader's authority essential and resistance to that authority dangerous or spiritually wrong. And it is maintained through a combination of sleep deprivation, irregular eating, psychedelic drug use, and the constant management of information about the outside world. Manson was not operating from a sophisticated theoretical understanding of cult psychology. He was operating from decades of experience manipulating people in prison environments, applied to a population of young people who were, in his assessment correctly, more susceptible to these techniques than the hardened criminals he had learned them on. He was effective because the techniques worked, not because he was uniquely brilliant. By 1968, Manson had assembled the core of what he called the family, a group of approximately 20 to 30 regular members with a larger peripheral orbit of sympathizers and occasional participants. They moved between San Francisco and Los Angeles, living communally in various locations, eventually settling primarily at the Spahn Ranch, a former movie ranch in the Santa Susana Mountains that were located northwest of Los Angeles. The ranch was owned by 80-year-old George Spahn, who was blind, and who allowed Manson's group to live there in exchange for various forms of assistance, including sexual favors from female family members. The ideology that Manson developed and taught to the family was a synthesis of elements drawn from multiple sources, combined into something that was entirely his own creation, and it served his specific needs. Understanding the ideology is essential to understanding the murders, because the murders were committed in the service of the ideology. Manson was obsessed with the Beatles, and so we learned that Manson was obsessed with the Beatles, and particularly with the White Album, that was released in November of 1968. He believed the album contained coded messages directed specifically at him, predicting and describing the apocalyptic race war that he called Helter Skelter, after the album's song of that name. The Beatles song is about a fairground slide. Manson's Helter Skelter was an apocalyptic race war in which Black Americans would rise up and kill white Americans, after which, because Black Americans were, in Manson's explicitly racist analysis, incapable of governing themselves, the family would emerge from their underground desert refuge to rule the new world. Let me be precise about what this ideology was. It was explicitly and centrally racist. It used the language of Black liberation and Black power as a frame while holding a view of Black Americans that was contemptuous and dehumanizing. It borrowed from the Nation of Islam's racial theology without understanding or endorsing its actual political content. It was not a sincere political analysis. It was a framework that gave Manson a reason to order murders while positioning the resulting chaos as someone else's fault. The specific mechanism of Helter Skelter was this. Manson believed that if the family committed murders and made them appear to be the work of Black radical groups, the resultant fear and retaliation among white Americans would ignite the race war he was predicting. The murders were designed to be provocative. To leave messages in blood, to target white victims in wealthy Los Angeles neighborhoods, to create the appearance of political violence by a Black radical movement. This is why Pig was written on Sharon Tate's front door. This is why Death to Pigs and Helter Skelter were written in blood at the LaBianca house. Manson was trying to start a war by framing someone else for murders he had ordered. That this plan was delusional does not make it less dangerous. It makes it more dangerous because it had an internal logic that could be explained to susceptible people in ways that made it seem very coherent. Manson was not preaching random violence. He was preaching purposeful violence in the service of a prophetic framework. And that is precisely the structure of radicalization that produces people willing to kill. In this segment, we're going to look at the family and who they were. So the core members, their background and transformation. Understanding the family members who committed the murders requires understanding who they were before Manson. None of them arrived at the murders as already formed, violent people. They arrived as troubled young people who were transformed through the specific process of cult indoctrination into people capable of actions they would not have been capable of before. This is the most important and most consistently overlooked fact about the Manson case. And so the first person we're going to analyze is Susan Denise Atkins, also known as Sadie Mae Glutz. Susan Denise Atkins was born on May 7, 1948, in San Gabriel, California. Her mother died of cancer when Susan was 14 years old. Her father, a drifter and alcoholic, could not maintain the family, and Susan and her brothers were placed in various living situations. So she ran away from home at 18, began working as a topless dancer in San Francisco under a false name, and was arrested and briefly jailed for her involvement with Anton LaVey's Church of Satan as a performer. She was 19 when she met Charles Manson. Manson's offer of a family, of belonging, of spiritual significance was precisely what Susan Atkins' history had left her hungry for. She became one of his earliest and most devoted followers, and by 1969 she was fully indoctrinated into the helter-skelter ideology and had given herself entirely to Manson's authority. Susan Atkins was one of the three killers at the Tate House on the night of August 9th. Susan Atkins was one of the three killers at the Tate House on the night of August 9th. She held Sharon Tate as Tate begged for her life of her unborn child. She stabbed Sharon Tate multiple times. She dipped her finger in Sharon Tate's blood and wrote the word pig on the front door. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The death penalty was commuted to life in prison when California briefly abolished capital punishment in 1972. She remained in prison for the rest of her life. In 2008, she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and applied for a compassionate release. Her application was denied. She died in prison on September 24, 2009, at the age of 61, having served a total of 40 years. And the second person we're going to analyze is Patricia Diane Krenwinkel, also known as Katie to the family. Patricia Diane Krenwinkel was born on December the 3rd in 1947 in Los Angeles. She grew up in a middle-class family, attended Catholic school, briefly attended college in Alabama, and was working as a processing clerk in Manhattan Beach, California, when she met Charles Manson in 1967. She was 19 years old. By multiple accounts, she was immediately and completely captivated. She left her apartment, left her car, left her job, and followed Manson without notifying anyone where she was going. Krenwinkel has described in subsequent interviews a young woman who felt profoundly unwanted and unattractive, and who found in Manson's attention and in the family's communal warmth something she had never felt before: acceptance. This experience is consistent with the documented patterns of cult recruitment and with the specific techniques Manson used on women with poor self-image. Krenwinkel participated in both nights of murders. At the Tate House, she chased Abigail Folger across the lawn and stabbed her repeatedly. At the LaBianca house, she stabbed Rosemary LaBianca and carved the word war into Leno LaBianca's stomach. She later wrote Helter Skelter on the refrigerator in Rosemary LaBianca's blood. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1972. She has been eligible for parole since the 1970s and has been denied parole more than 13 times. As of this recording, she remains incarcerated in the California Institution for Women. She is one of the longest-serving female prisoners in California history. Krenwinkel has, in her parole hearings and in public interviews, expressed what appears to be genuine remorse and a genuine understanding of the process by which she was manipulated. Her expressions of remorse are not a reason to minimize what she did. They are a reason to take seriously the question of what happened to a 19-year-old woman from a middle-class Catholic family in the 2 years between her meeting Charles Manson and her participation in 7 murders. And so the next person we'll discuss is Linda Kasabian. Linda Kasabian was born on June the 21st, 1949, in Biddeford, Maine. She grew up in New Hampshire and was, by her own account, a young woman searching for meaning and community in the counterculture of the late 1960s. She had been married twice before her 20s, had a daughter, and was living in a commune in New Mexico before traveling to California and joining the Manson family in July of 1969. She had been a member of the family for approximately 5 weeks when the murders occurred. Kasabian's role in the murder was different from Atkins and Krenwinkel's. She was present at both the Tate and La Bianca houses, drove the car on the Tate night, and served as a lookout. She did not personally kill anyone. She later testified that she was terrified by what she witnessed and that she tried to intervene to stop the killings without success. Kasabian's decision to cooperate with the prosecution and the quality and specificity of her testimony was the most important single factor in the convictions. She was the eyewitness who had been present at both scenes, who had not killed, and who was willing to testify in detail about what had happened. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi made a decision to offer her immunity in exchange for her testimony, a decision that was controversial, but that he later defended as the only way to build a case against the other defendants. Kasabian received immunity from prosecution. She has lived a private life since the trial, appearing occasionally to give a testimony about the continuing danger she believed the still incarcerated family members represented. She declined interviews for most of her post-trial life. And we move on to one of the males. His name was Charles Denton Watson, also known as Tex. Charles Denton Watson was born on December the 2nd, 1945, in Cokeville, Texas. He grew up in a stable religious family in Farmersville, Texas. He was a high school honors student and star athlete, attended North Texas State University, and was, by the accounts of people who knew him before Manson, a very personable, conventional young man with a conventional future ahead of him. He moved to Los Angeles in 1967. He began using drugs heavily, and then he met Manson through a mutual acquaintance. Watson was, by the time of the murders in August 1969, a severe amphetamine user whose cognitive and psychological function had been significantly degraded by drug use in addition to the systematic indoctrination of the Manson family. He was also physically large, affected with weapons, and entirely committed to Manson's authority. Watson was described as a primary killer on both nights. At the Tate house, he shot Stephen Parent in the car at the gate. He entered the house and shot Wojtek Rykowski, stabbed him multiple times, beat him with a gun butt. He shot and stabbed Jay Sebring. He stabbed Sharon Tate. He was the most physically active and the most lethal participant in both nights of murders. Watson was in Texas when the arrests came and was extradited separately. He was tried separately from the other defendants and convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life in 1972. He had been denied parole 18 times. He became an ordained minister in prison and founded a prison ministry called Abounding Love Ministries. He remains incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County. And we move on to Leslie Van Houten. And Leslie Van Houten was born on August 23, 1949 in Altadena, California. She was a homecoming princess of her high school. She had been a cheerleader. She had grown up in a comfortable middle-class family in a Los Angeles suburb. Her parents' divorce when she was 14 was the first serious disruption to what appeared to be an entirely conventional life. She got pregnant at 17, had an abortion that her parents arranged, and experienced profound guilt and grief over it. She then began using drugs and became involved in the counterculture. She then joined the Manson family in 1968. She was 19 years old at the time. She has described in interviews over the decades since a process of psychological dissolution that the family's methods produced, which was the gradual erosion of her prior identity, the replacement of her own values with Manson's ideology, the systematic destruction of her capacity for independent judgment and thought. Van Houten participated in the LaBianca murders. She held Rosemary LaBianca while Corinne Winkle stabbed her. She stabbed Rosemary LaBianca's already dead body multiple times, later saying she wanted to feel part of what was happening. This detail, stabbing a corpse to feel included, is one of the most disturbing in the entire case. Not because it is the most violent act, but because it illustrates so perfectly the degree to which her own will and judgment had been replaced by the social dynamics of the group. Van Houten was tried 3 times. Her first trial ended in a mistrial when her attorney Ronald Hughes disappeared and was presumed murdered during the winter storm in November of 1970. Her second trial resulted in a conviction that was reversed on appeal because of the attorney issue. Her third trial resulted in a second conviction. She was sentenced to life in prison. Leslie Van Houten has been, by the assessment of prison psychologists, parole boards, and outside observers who have engaged with her over decades, the most thoroughly rehabilitated of the convicted family members. She has expressed consistent, detailed, and apparently genuine remorse. She has worked in prison advocacy and education programs. The California Board of Parole Hearings recommended her for parole 5 times between 2016 and 2022. Governor Jerry Brown reversed the parole recommendations 3 times. Governor Gavin Newsom reversed them at least twice before. In 2023, after her 6th recommendation for parole, the California Supreme Court ruled that Newsom's reversal had been improper, and Van Houten was released on parole in July of 2023 at the age of 73, having served 53 years in prison. Her release was opposed by the families of the victims and by the Los Angeles County District Attorney. It was supported by a significant number of criminal justice reform advocates and legal scholars who argued that her continued incarceration, long past any reasonable assessment of her dangerousness, was driven by the politics of the Manson name rather than by individualized assessment of her case. And with that, we've come to Steve Grogan, also known as Clem. Steve Grogan was born in 1951 and was 17 years old when he joined the Manson family. He was, even among the family members, considered by Manson himself to be of limited intellectual capacity. Manson reportedly called him Scramblehead. He participated in the murder of Donald Shea, a stuntman at Spawn Ranch who was killed in August 1969 because Manson believed Shea had been cooperating with police. Grogan drove Manson's car that night and participated in the stabbing. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, commuted to life in 1972. He was paroled in 1985, the only convicted Manson family killer to be paroled, largely because of his cooperation with investigators in locating Donald Shea's remains. And we're coming to another male who participated in the Manson murders, and we've come to Robert Busolil. Robert Kenneth Busolil was born on November 6, 1947 in Santa Barbara, California. He was a musician and actor who had been involved with the counterculture and with Manson's orbit before becoming a full family member. He committed the first of the murders directly connected to the family. On July 25, 1969, he stabs and strangled Gary Hinman, a music teacher who had been a peripheral associate of the family. Manson had sent Busolil to collect money he believed Hinman owed. When Hinman refused or was unable to pay, Busolil killed him. He was arrested shortly afterward in possession of Hinman's car with the murder weapon in his sleeping bag. The Hinman murder was a direct catalyst for the Tate and LaBianca murders. Manson believed that if the family committed murders that looked like the work of radical black groups, while Busolil was in jail for a similar-looking crime, the police would conclude that Busolil had been wrongly imprisoned and release him. This was Manson's stated logic for the timing and framing of the August murders. It was, like the broader helter-skelter plan, delusional. Busolil was tried and convicted of first-degree murder for the Hinman killing. He has been denied parole multiple times and remains incarcerated. And with that, we're going to examine three other people: Charles Watson, Mary Bruner, and Bruce Davis. Mary Bruner was the first woman to join Manson's family, meeting him in Berkeley in 1967 when she was working as a librarian. She was a college graduate, 23 years old, and she became Manson's first follower. She participated in the Hinman murder. She was given immunity for her testimony against Busolil, then subsequently arrested for a credit card robbery, and was therefore in custody at the time of the Tate and LaBianca murders. Bruce David was a family member who participated in the murders of both Gary Hinman and Donald Shea. He joined Manson's orbit in 1967 and was one of the more deeply committed ideologically of the family's male members. He was convicted of first-degree murder in the Hinman and Shea cases and has been recommended for parole by the parole board multiple times, but has since been denied release by successive California governors. Davis became an ordained minister in prison as of late. Catherine Scher, Sandra Good, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, and Nancy Pittman were among the family members who were not convicted of the murders, but who remained devoted to Manson long after his imprisonment. Fromm became particularly significant. On September 25, 1975, she pointed a semi-automatic pistol at President Gerald Ford in Sacramento, California. The weapon did not fire because there was no bullet in the chamber, though the magazine was loaded. She was convicted of attempted assassination of the president and sentenced to life in prison. She was paroled in 2009. Sandra Good was convicted of sending threatening letters to corporate executives and served 4 years in federal prison. The continued devotion of these women to Manson after his imprisonment illustrates the depth of the psychological transformation the family had produced. And so in this segment, we have to remember their names, the people who were murdered in those 2 nights. 7 people were murdered across 2 nights in August 1969. 2 additional people, Gary Hinman and Donald Shea, were killed by family members in connected crimes. I want to tell you about each one of them. The Tate night, August 9, 1969, 10050 Cielo Drive. Sharon Marie Tate was 26 years old. She had been born on January 24, 1943, in Dallas, Texas. She was the daughter of an Army officer. Her childhood moved with her father's postings: Texas, Germany, San Francisco. She was beautiful in the specific way that the camera loves: high cheekbones, dark eyes, a face that translated perfectly to screen. She began modeling at 16 and made her film debut in a small role in 1963. Her career accelerated through the mid-1960s. She appeared in 13 television shows and films before her most significant role in the 1968 Roman Polanski film, Rosemary's Baby. She married Roman Polanski in January 1968. The marriage was, by all accounts of people who knew them, genuinely loving and characterized by the particular excitement of two people at the center of the entertainment world in one of its most creative periods. She was 8.5 months pregnant when she was murdered. Her son, whom she had planned to name Paul Richard Polanski, also died. She was stabbed 16 times. She begged for the life of her baby. She was 26 years old. Jay Sebring was 35 years old. He was born Thomas John Kummer on October 10, 1933, in Millbrook, Alabama, and has changed his name when he moved to Los Angeles and built a career as one of the most celebrated hairstylists in Hollywood. He styled the hair of Frank Sinatra, Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Jim Morrison, and even Bruce Lee, and dozens of other entertainment industry figures. He had previously dated Sharon Tate before her relationship with Polanski began and had remained a close friend. He was at the house that night as a friend. Sebring had founded what became the Sebring International Hair Salon chain and was one of the pioneers of the men's grooming industry in the United States. He was shot once and stabbed 7 times. He died trying to protect Sharon Tate. He was 35 years old. Abigail Ann Folger was 25 years old. She was born on August 11, 1943, in San Francisco, the daughter of Peter Folger, heir to the Folger coffee fortune, and of Inez Mejia Folger. She attended Radcliffe College, studied art history at Harvard, and worked for the publisher Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in New York before moving to Los Angeles with her boyfriend Frykowski. She was a social activist who had been doing volunteer work in the Watts neighborhood, working with community organizations and donating significantly to civil rights causes. She had been vacationing at the Cielo Drive house with Frykowski. She ran from the house when the attack began. Patricia Krenwinkel caught her on the lawn and stabbed her 28 times. She was 25 years old. I have difficulty pronouncing his first name, but Mr. Frykowski was 32 years old. He was born on December 22nd, 1936, in Poland. He was a close childhood friend of Roman Polanski, who had immigrated to the United States to make his fortune in the film industry. He had aspirations as a screenwriter and had been involved peripherally in various film projects. He was also staying at the Cielo Drive house with Folger. Frykowski was shot twice, struck over the head 13 times with a gun butt, and stabbed 51 times. He fought back against Watson with extraordinary ferocity before he died. He was 32 years old, a man far from his homeland, killed in a house belonging to his best friend. Stephen Earl Parent was 18 years old. He was born on December 12, 1951 in Los Angeles. He had nothing to do with the Tate household or with anyone in it. He was friends with William Garretson, the caretaker who lived in a small cottage on the property and who was not present in the main house that night. Parent had driven up to Spahn Ranch that evening to sell Garretson a clock radio. He was leaving alone in his car, backing out of the driveway, when Watson encountered him at the gate. Watson then shoots him 4 times. Stephen Parent was 18 years old. He was a high school student going home after visiting a friend. He had no connection to any one of the killers that had been sent to kill. He was just simply there at the wrong time. And we're going to segue on to the La Bianca night, August the 10th, 1969. The address, 3301 Waverly Drive. Lino Anthony LaBianca was 44 years old. He was born on October 6, 1925, in Los Angeles, the son of Italian immigrants. He was the president of State Grocery, a California supermarket chain, and was by any measure a successful and respected businessman. He had a son from a previous marriage and had been married to Rosemary for years. He and Rosemary had returned home from a weekend at Lake Isabella and were asleep when Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten entered the house. Lino LaBianca was tied up, stabbed 12 times, and had a carving fork driven into his stomach and left there. The word war was carved into his skin. He was 44 years old. He had done nothing wrong. He had been chosen because Manson knew the neighborhood from a previous party he had attended nearby, and because the house was isolated enough to serve his purposes. Rosemary Ann LaBianca was 38 years old. She was born on December 21st, 1930 in Montevideo, Uruguay, and had come to the United States as a child. She had worked her way up from waitress to owner of a dress boutique called The Gateway. She was an entrepreneurial woman who had built something of her own. She was stabbed 41 times. She fought back. Despite being bound, she managed to strike Krenwinkel with a lamp. She was 38 years old, and she was not going to stop fighting. And so then we're going to discuss the connected murders. Gary Allen Hinman was 34 years old. He was a musician and music teacher with a PhD student who had been a peripheral acquaintance of the Manson family through the music scene. He was generous, frequently letting people crash at his house, and this generosity was what exposed him to the family. When Manson sent Busolil, Brunner, and Atkins to his house to collect money he believed Hinman owed, Hinman told him he had no such money. He was held for 2 days. Manson came personally and sliced his ear with a sword. Busolil stabbed him to death. Manson himself wrote "Political Piggy" on the wall in Hinman's blood. He was 34 years old. Donald Jerome Shea was 35 years old, a ranch hand and part-time stuntman who had worked at the Spawn Ranch for years. Manson believed Shea had been talking to police about the family's activities. In late August 1969, Manson, Watson, and Grogan drove Shea away from the ranch and killed him. His body was not found until 1977, when Grogan led investigators to the burial site as part of his parole cooperation. And so now this leads us to the investigation and trial. The investigation occurred from August to December of 1969. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation of the Tate murders was, in its initial weeks, one of the most expensive and least productive in the department's history. The LAPD had a significant budget, significant forensic resources, and the full attention of the public and the press. What it did not have in the first months of the investigation was a working theory of the case that could accommodate the specific evidence. The problem was not a shortage of investigative activity. It was a shortage of the right investigative framework. Investigators initially focused on the personal and professional lives of the victims, on drug deals gone wrong, on Sharon Tate's connections to the film world, on possible organized crime involvement. They investigated the film director John Schlesinger, the actor John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, and numerous other individuals connected to the Tate social circle. None of these leads went anywhere productive. The LAPD did not initially connect the Tate murders to the LaBianca murders. The two cases were handled by separate detective divisions. This jurisdictional separation, homicide special handling Tate, The regular homicide division handling LaBianca was a structural problem that delayed the recognition of the connection for weeks. The break in the case came, as breaks often do, from a combination of indirect sources. In October 1969, a member of the Manson family named Barbara Hoyt, who had been at Spahn Ranch during the summer, began talking to authorities. Simultaneously, a raid on Spahn Ranch, conducted in connection with car theft charges, had brought several family members into custody, where they talked. And on October 12, 1969, a young woman named Kitty Lutzinger, Robert Buchalil's girlfriend, who had been present at the Hinman house during the days of his captivity before his murder, was arrested in connection with the Shea murder and began providing information. The Hinman murder, which had been separately investigated, began to look connected. The suspects in Hinman's death had Manson family connections. Buchalil was already in custody for Hinman. The word on the wall at Hinman, political piggy, rhymed thematically with pig on the Tate front door. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction over the Hinman case, and the LAPD, which had the Tate and LaBianca cases. The word on the wall at Hinman, political piggy, rhymed thematically with pig on the Tate front door. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction over the Hinman case, and the LAPD, which had the Tate and LaBianca cases, finally began comparing notes. On November the 18th, 1969, Susan Atkins, who had been arrested in connection with car theft and was in custody in the Los Angeles County Jail, told his cellmate named Ronnie Howard what she had done at the Tate house. Howard told her attorney. Her attorney told law enforcement. Atkins had, in the combination of her own pride and her inability to maintain silence, provided the investigators with their first direct inside account of the murders. Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, Kasabian, and others were arrested in November and December of 1969. The investigation that had spent months looking in entirely the wrong direction had found its answer from the inside. And we're going to look at the key investigators and prosecutors of the case. Lieutenant Robert Helder was the LAPD homicide detective who was a primary investigator on the Tate case in its initial weeks. He had been criticized retrospectively for the investigative decisions that kept the case stalled for months. He was working within the limitations of the investigative framework available to him, but the failure to connect the Tate and LaBianca cases for weeks was a significant structural and procedural failure. And so other investigators, Sergeant Frank Patchett and Sergeant Danny Galindo, were the LAPD detectives who worked the LaBianca case and who eventually made the connection between the two sets of murders. Their recognition of the thematic similarities in the crime scene messages was an important moment in the investigation. Vincent Thomas Bugliosi was the Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney who prosecuted Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Van Houten. He was 35 years old when the trial began. He had a reputation as a brilliant and aggressive attorney who had lost only one case in his previous prosecutorial career. He was given the Manson case because he was the best trial lawyer the DA's office had at the time. Bugliosi's central prosecutorial challenge was this. Charles Manson had not personally committed any of the Tate or LaBianca murders. Proving that he was criminally responsible for murders committed by others required a legal theory that went beyond direct participation. The theory Bugliosi developed, that Manson had directed and psychologically controlled the killers, that he was a prime mover of a criminal enterprise that executed these murders on his orders, was legally and factually sound, but required a level of sustained argument about psychological influence and criminal conspiracy that was genuinely novel in California courts. And so in Bugliosi's 1974 book, Helter Skelter, which was co-written with journalist Kurt Gentry, became one of the best-selling true crime books in American publishing history. It remains the most widely read account of the case, and its framing of the events has shaped public understanding of the Manson murders more than any other single source. Bugliosi himself acknowledged in the book and in subsequent interviews that his prosecution of the case, while legally sound, involved the presentation of Helter Skelter as a primary motive in ways that may have oversimplified the reality of Manson's psychology and the family's dynamics. He believed in the Helter Skelter theory. He also understood that it was a theory that made for a compelling courtroom narrative and that these two facts are not always distinguishable. Bugliosi died on June 6, 2015. And so now that we've covered the prosecution, and now that we've discussed a little bit about the prosecution, we are going to examine the defense attorneys and their challenges in the Manson case. Irving Kanarack was Charles Manson's attorney. He was appointed by the court after Manson's previous attorneys withdrew. Kanarack was known for extreme and disruptive trial tactics, making objections to virtually every statement from witnesses and prosecutors, filing endless motions, and generally doing everything possible to delay and complicate proceedings. His presentation of Manson was consistent with this reputation. He objected at various points to the prosecution's use of the word kill, to the reading of the indictment, to virtually every piece of evidence offered. Ronald Hughes was Leslie Van Houten's original attorney, a young and inexperienced lawyer who was in over his head in the case of the century. Hughes disappeared during a camping trip in November 1970 during a winter storm in Cesp Hot Springs in Ventura County. His decomposed body was found in March 1971. His death was officially ruled an accident, though some researchers and former family members have suggested it was a murder ordered by Manson in retaliation for his insistence on presenting a defense for Van Houten that might embarrass Manson. This has never been proven to date. Paul Fitzgerald was Patricia Krenwinkel's attorney. Dacian represented Susan Atkins. Both attorneys were experienced criminal defense lawyers who found themselves representing clients who, in several instances, appeared to be actively working against their own defense in deference to Manson's authority over them. And so we're going to look at the trial that happened in June 1970 through January 1971. The trial of Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten began on June 15, 1970, at the Los Angeles Hall of Justice. It would last a total of 211 days, making it at the time the longest murder trial in American history. It cost an estimated $1 million to prosecute. It produced more than 31,000 pages of transcript, and it was, from the first day to the last, a spectacle unlike anything the American legal system had previously experienced. Manson arrived at the first day of trial with an X carved on his forehead. He said he had crossed himself out of your world. The next morning, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten appeared with matching X's carved into their foreheads. The Manson family members who had not been arrested maintained a vigil outside the courthouse for much of the trial, sitting on the sidewalk, shaving their heads in solidarity, chanting and praying. They were led by Lynette Squeaky Fromm and Sandra Good. Inside the courtroom, Manson and his co-defendants were disruptive, threatening, and contemptuous of the proceedings. Manson at one point lunged at Judge Charles Holder with a sharpened pencil, yelling, "Someone should cut your head off, old man." The co-defendants stood up and began chanting Latin in response to rulings they disagreed with. Judge Older had them removed from the courtroom on multiple occasions, and the atmosphere was unlike any previous criminal proceeding in Los Angeles history. The prosecution's case was built on Linda Kasabian's testimony, which ran for 18 days and provided the most complete insider account of both nights of the murder. Bugliosi presented her as a star witness. She had been present at both crime scenes. She had not personally killed anyone. She had been deeply affected by what she witnessed, and she was willing to testify in full and specific detail. Her testimony was extensively cross-examined, but was not substantially undermined. Manson chose not to testify in the guilt phase of the trial, then made a motion to address the court outside the presence of the jury. Judge Older allowed him to read a statement. The statement was rambling, messianic, and contained some of the most revealing articulations of his self-mythology that he ever produced publicly. He said, in part, "I have ate out of your garbage cans to stay out of jail. I have swore your secondhand clothes. I have done my best to get along in your world, and now you want to kill me." The jury convicted all 4 defendants, Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, of first-degree murder on all counts on January the 25th, 1971. They were sentenced to death in April 1971. The Supreme Court abolished the death penalty in California in February 1972, in People v. Anderson, finding the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment under the California Constitution. The death sentences of Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten were automatically commuted to life in prison. Manson subsequently received additional charges and convictions related to other crimes. The X on his forehead was eventually converted by Manson himself into a swastika. He remained incarcerated at various California state prisons until his death. Charles Manson died on November 19, 2017, at the Corcoran State Prison Hospital from natural causes including colon cancer and cardiac arrest. He was 83 years old. He had been in prison continuously since 1969, 48 years. He died as he had lived for most of his life, incarcerated. He received more media coverage in death than any figure of comparable notoriety in recent American history. And so we've come to this part of the episode in which we discuss how Manson built a family. And it was through cult dynamics and coercive control. The academic literature on cult dynamics and coercive control has, in the decades since the Manson case, developed a sophisticated understanding of the mechanisms by which groups like the Manson family operate. This understanding is directly applicable to the case and illuminates aspects of it that the public mythology has consistently obscured. The sociologist Robert Lifton identified 8 criteria for thought reform environments in his 1961 book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, Milieu Control, Mystical Manipulation, A Demand for Purity, Confession, The Sacred Science, Loading the Language, The Doctrine over Person, and a Dispensing of Existence. The Manson family examined against this criteria displays all 8 with unusual clarity. Milieu control, an example of that would be at the Spawn Ranch. The family controlled the environment completely. Who came in, what information was available, what conversations were permitted, what activities were undertaken. All of this was regulated by Manson's authority. Mystical manipulation. Manson presented himself as a Christ figure, as a prophet, as someone who understood the universe in ways ordinary people could not. And the demand for purity. The family's ideology required the complete abandonment of prior identity, prior relationships, prior values. And we come to another aspect of this, confession. Members were encouraged to share their deepest fears, shames, and vulnerabilities with Manson, who used this information to maintain psychological control. And yet another tenet, the sacred science, Helter Skelter was not presented as a theory, but as an inevitable truth, protected from challenge by its sacred status. And loading the language. The family developed an extensive vocabulary of in-group terms that made communication with outsiders increasingly difficult. And then we discussed doctrine over person, which is members' personal perceptions and experiences were systematically subordinated to the requirements of the ideology. And then we come to the dispensing of existence. Manson defined who was spiritually alive and who was not, and who was part of the in-group and who was outside of it. And so the person who enters this environment does not experience a sudden transformation. Instead, they experience a gradual erosion, a slow replacement of one reality framework with another, managed by someone who is skilled at reading what they need and providing exactly that, until the prior self is no longer accessible and the constructed self is all that remains. This is not weakness. This is the result of a sophisticated, sustained psychological technique applied to human beings, all of whom have vulnerabilities that such techniques can exploit. The family members who committed the murders were not, before Manson, the people who committed them. They became those people through a process. Understanding that process is not the same as excusing the outcome. It is essential to preventing it from happening again. And so what became at the end of the 60s? There is a standard narrative about what the Manson murders meant culturally. And I want to engage with it carefully because it contains both truth and distortion. The standard narrative says that the Manson murders killed the 1960s, that the idealism of the counterculture, the naive faith in peace and love, and the transformative power of expanded consciousness was exposed by the murders as hollow and ultimately self-destructive, that the summer of love ended in the summer of blood. This narrative is emotionally satisfying and for the most part partially true. It is also the way of understanding the murders that places them in the service of a cultural meaning rather than engaging with their human reality. To be clear, the murders did not kill the 1960s in any simple sense. The political movements of the decade, which was civil rights, feminism, anti-war activism, labor organizing, they all continued after 1969, and they all produced lasting legislative and cultural changes. The suggestion that the Manson murders somehow invalidated those movements is an argument that was made explicitly and immediately by the political right, which saw in Manson an opportunity to discredit everything it had opposed about the 1960s. What the murders did do, specifically and demonstrably, was accelerate the disintegration of the specific counterculture ecosystem that had produced the Manson family. The communal living movement in Southern California contracted rapidly after the murders, as a media narrative about the dangers of commune life reached the public that was already anxious. The relationship openness and trust that had characterized the counterculture social environment, that is, the willingness to take in strangers, to share resources, to extend community membership to whoever showed up and identified with the values, became something to be ashamed of or frightened by. This contraction had costs as well as benefits. The social networks of mutual support and alternative community that the counterculture had built imperfect as they were, served real human needs for many people. Their destruction, driven partly by fear generated by the Manson murders, left some of those needs unmet. The people who had found in the counterculture a community that welcomed them regardless of background or history found that community suddenly more hostile and more guarded. Manson destroyed something he had parasitized, and the people who had genuinely benefited from it paid part of the price. And this leads us to this. I want to say something about the racial dimensions of the Manson case that is rarely said directly in popular accounts. Manson's helter-skelter ideology was explicitly built around anti-Black racism. He believed Black Americans would launch a genocidal uprising against white people. He believed this uprising was inevitable and divinely ordained. He committed murders that were designed to be blamed on Black radical groups. He used the word pigs as a connection to Black Panther Party rhetoric, trying to frame his murders as a Black militant violence. The response of white Los Angeles to the murders, the immediate spike in gun sales, the sudden fear of home invasion, the suspension of the easy social openness that had characterized much of the counterculture, contained within it an element of racial fear that the Manson mythology subsequently obscured. The murders tapped into anxieties about Black militancy and urban racial conflict that were already present in white Los Angeles in 1969, 3 years after the Watts riots, 2 years after the urban uprisings of 1967. Manson was exploiting those anxieties as part of his plan. The anxieties he exploited were real, even if his plan was insane. The long-term effect of the murders on the relationship between white progressive Los Angeles and the Black political movements of the era was complicated and damaging in ways that have not been fully examined. The word pig, the language of uprising, the rhetoric of revolutionary violence, with irrational murderous danger. This association served the interests of those who wanted to discredit Black radical politics, and it was an association that Manson had specifically designed his crimes to produce. And so what of the political and legal ramifications? And so this is where the death penalty and the case of California versus Anderson take place. The California Supreme Court's 1972 decision in People versus Anderson, which found the death penalty unconstitutional under the California Constitution, and automatically commuted the death sentences of Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, was one of the most significant state court decisions in the history of American capital punishment. It preceded the United States Supreme Court's federal death penalty moratorium in Furman versus Georgia by 5 months. The commutation of the Manson family death sentences was immediately and intensely unpopular with the California public, which had broadly supported the original sentences. The political backlash contributed to a successful 1972 California ballot initiative that amended the state constitution to permit capital punishment, effectively overriding Anderson at the state constitutional level. The California death penalty was subsequently reinstated under the revised constitutional framework. The Manson case thus became a direct catalyst for the reinstatement of the California death penalty. It was an outcome that demonstrates a complex and sometimes perverse relationship between specific high-profile criminal cases and the broader legal and political landscape of criminal prosecution. The murders and the public fury at the commutation of the death sentences helped build the political foundation for a reinstatement of capital punishment that went far beyond the Manson case and affected the legal fate of thousands of people who had nothing to do with it. But how did RICO, RICO, and the legal framework for conspiracy prosecutions tie into all of this. Vincent Bugliosi's prosecution of Charles Manson on a theory of criminal liability for murders he did not personally commit was legally innovative and influenced subsequent prosecutorial theory for decades. The argument that a person who directs, organizes, and psychologically controls others who commit murder is equally guilty of those murders, even without physical presence at the crime, was not novel in its broad outlines, but was developed with unusual specificity in the Manson prosecution. So the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, which was enacted in 1970, provided a federal statutory framework for prosecuting criminal enterprises in ways that anticipated the issues the Manson prosecution had highlighted at the state level. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge the leaders of criminal organizations for the crimes of their subordinates, on the theory that the organizational structure itself constituted the crime. While RICO was primarily designed for organized crime prosecutions, its logic was directly applicable to cult-like criminal enterprises, and the Manson case had demonstrated both the need for and the feasibility of such prosecutorial theories. And so how does the media figure in all of this? So the Manson case produced a media response that was, in its scale and its character, unprecedented in American criminal history, and that established the template for the relationship between high-profile criminal cases and media coverage that has dominated the industry ever since. The trial generated thousands of articles in newspapers across the country. It produced multiple books. Bugliosi's Helter Skelter was the most significant, but by no means the only one. It produced documentary films, documentary television, and eventually feature films and streaming series. Every decade since 1969 has seen new media productions re-examining the Manson case. The case has never fully left the public imagination. This sustained media attention has had consequences. It has, as I noted earlier, significantly shaped the public understanding of the case by centering Manson's mythology at the expense of the victim's humanity and the perpetrator's human complexity. It has created the conditions under which Manson himself remained a cultural figure of fascination long after any legitimate public interest in him had been served. And it has contributed to the romanization of the case, the endless fascination with Manson's charisma, the re-examination of his music, the women who still write to him, in ways that represent exactly the kind of perpetrator-centered coverage that this podcast is committed to resisting. The American Bar Association's 1966 revision of its media in the courtroom standards and the ongoing debate about cameras in courtrooms drew on the Manson trial, alongside the Hockman trial and the O.J. Simpson trial, as examples of cases where media access has distorted the administration of justice. The question of how to balance the public's right to observe judicial proceedings against the defendant's right to a fair trial has not definitively been answered by any of these cases, but each of them has pushed the argument forward. And so we'll look at the parole and the politics of punishment. The parole history of the convicted family members is one of the most sustained and politically charged examples of the intersection between individual criminal cases and electoral politics in American history. Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins had been denied parole so many times that the denials had become essentially automatic. The Manson name carries a political weight that makes any governor's signature and a parole approval for a family member an act of political self-destruction. This is true regardless of the individual circumstances of the specific prisoner's rehabilitation, dangerousness, or time served. The Leslie Van Houten case illustrates this most directly. Van Houten was recommended for parole 6 times by the California Board of Parole Hearings, which is the institutional body charged with making individualized assessments of prisoner rehabilitation and potential dangerousness. Each time a California governor reversed the recommendation. The governors who did so were doing explicitly on the basis of the nature of the crime and the identity of the case, not on the basis of an individualized assessment of Van Houten's current dangerousness or character. The California Supreme Court's 2023 ruling that Newsom's reversal of Van Houten's parole was improper was a significant statement about the appropriate limits of gubernatorial authority over the parole process. A statement that the decision must be made on the basis of the individual, not on the basis of the crime's notoriety or the political consequences of the decision. It was a ruling that applied directly to Van Houten, but its implications extended to every case where political considerations distort what is supposed to be an individualized assessment of rehabilitation and risk. The broader question the Van Houten case raises, whether the criminal justice system should keep people incarcerated past any reasonable assessment of their current dangerousness because of the symbolic or political significance of their crime, is one of the most important questions in contemporary criminal justice. It is a question that the Manson case makes impossible to avoid. And so what about the legacy of Helter Skelter? I want to close the political ramifications segment with something that gets almost no serious attention in most treatments of the Manson case. That is, the legacy of Helter Skelter as an idea. Manson was not the first person to prophesy an apocalyptic race war in America, and he has not been the last. The specific ideology he constructed, the coming race war that will allow a chosen group to inherit the ruins, is a structure that appears across American extremist movements from the 1960s to the present. It appears in the writings of white supremacist organizations from the Order in the 1980s to Brenton Tarrant's manifesto before the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019. It appears in the accelerationist wing of the contemporary white nationalist movement, which explicitly advocates for violence designed to trigger a race war. Tarrant himself cited Manson alongside other accelerationist figures. This is not to say that Manson created this ideology or that his influence is uniquely responsible for its persistence. The apocalyptic race war framework has deep roots in American white supremacist thought that predates Manson entirely. But Manson's specific formulation, that is to commit violence, to blame it on black people, and let the resulting chaos produce the conditions for a chosen group's ascendance, has been cited by subsequent extremists in ways that make the Manson case directly relevant to the contemporary accelerationist movement. Understanding Manson as a figure in the history of American extremist thought, rather than primarily as a true crime sensation, is necessary for understanding why the case continues to matter. He was not simply a charismatic madman who manipulated vulnerable young people to commit murder. He was a practitioner of a specific kind of ideological violence that has recurred in different forms and contexts throughout American history and that shows no signs of disappearing. The episode is called Helter Skelter because That is the name Manson gave to his apocalyptic fantasy. And because that name has been so thoroughly absorbed into the culture of the case that pretending it doesn't exist would be dishonest. But I want to end by pushing back on what the name represents, though. The murders were not in any meaningful sense about a Beatles song, or the White Album for that matter. They were not the product of a brilliantly designed apocalyptic scheme. They were the product of a deeply damaged, deeply manipulative man who had spent his entire life exploiting people, who found in the specific vulnerabilities of the counterculture of 1969 an opportunity to exploit them at scale, and who convinced young people from ordinary American families to commit murder in the service of a fantasy that served primarily his own needs for power and significance. The cultural mythology of Manson as a mastermind, the endless fascination with his hold over the family, the movies, the books, and series that center his charisma and his philosophy, is itself a continuation of what he started. He wanted to be significant. He wanted to matter. He wanted his name to be known. In this, the most nihilistic dimension of his project, he succeeded more completely than in anything else. He is known. His name is on an entire cultural genre of fascination. He is more famous than any of the people he murdered. Sharon Tate wanted to be a mother. Jay Sebring wanted to build something in the world of men's grooming, and he did. Abigail Folger was doing volunteer work in Watts while attending parties in Bel Air, and she was trying to figure out how to reconcile those two parts of her life, the way people do. Wojtek Frykowski was a long way from Poland, trying to make something in a foreign country. Stephen Parent was 8 years old and going home. Leno LaBianca was asleep in his house. Rosemary LaBianca fought back. Gary Hinman was generous to the wrong people. Donald Shea worked at a ranch, and somebody decided he was dangerous. These are the people that the Manson case should be about. The rest is mythology. And the mythology, however vivid, however culturally embedded, is not the story. These people that were murdered, they are the story. Thank you for listening to ZeitCrimes. Resources related to cult recovery, coercive control, and the advocacy organizations working on criminal justice reform in California are linked in the show notes. Next time we continue. Until then, as usual, please take care of yourselves.